Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the happy hexmage, Lynde Cheerful Tormentor. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to buy me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commander won last week's poll and what commanders you can vote for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Lynde Cheerful Tormentor is a 2/4 human warlock that costs 1, a blue, a black, a red, has death touch, and the following abilities. Whenever a curse is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, return it to the battlefield attached to you at the beginning of the next end step. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may attach a curse attached to you to one of your opponents. If you do, draw 2 cards. As we can see, Lynde is possessing a mid-size CMC, below average stats for her cost, but a good defensive keyword to make up for it, and an interesting set of abilities that focus around curses and making sure that they never truly leave play. Breaking down her first ability, on the surface it simply allows us to bring any of our curses that get destroyed right back into play, with the unfortunate downside of doing so attached to us. But when looking a bit deeper, this ability can actually become a fair bit more complicated depending on what triggered it. For example, what happens to a double-faced card like a Cursed Witch when it goes to the grave while it's transformed into a curse? Well, as it turns out, Lynde still considers this a curse going to the graveyard despite the witch being a creature on its front side, which allows us to return it back into play with Lynde's effect, but as a creature instead of a curse since we can't actually bring it into play transformed. The inverse of this would be true for something like Curse of Leeches if it were to go to the graveyard on its creature side. Since it was not a curse at the time of being destroyed, it would not be recurred by Lynde's effect, despite its front side actually being a curse. This also applies to any clone effects that copy our curses, allowing our commander to return them back into play if they were a curse when they were sent to the graveyard, which then allows them to copy something else when they ETB. Either unattached to anything if the new copy can't attach, attaching to us if it copies a curse or other aura that can attach to players, or ending up back in the graveyard if it copies an aura that cannot attach to players. Before we continue, I'd like to thank the folks over at rmagictcg for breaking down those rules interactions, and I'll include a link to that thread in the description, as well as a video from Judge FTW that covers some of these topics if you'd like to see a more complete breakdown of why these effects interact the way they do. Moving on to Lynde's second ability, this turns our first ability from a detriment to an actual benefit, allowing us to re-enchant our opponents with our curses and getting us some card advantage in the process. Do keep in mind, however, that we are limited to 1 curse per upkeep, and we still suffer any upkeep-related effects that curse may give us. But ultimately, it's still a good source of card advantage that still leaves our curses in play to be attached to our opponents later. So, considering the curse synergy we just saw, it will come to no one's surprise that the build we'll be focusing on today will be curse-themed, aiming to enchant our opponents with all manners of hexes and blights, ranging from straightforward damage and life lost, to more disruptive effects to hamper our opponent's board states, and even effects that don't hamper our opponent's board states but instead benefit us or those who attack them. And with all these curse enchantments flying around, we'll be running plenty of payoffs to make the most of them, letting us get even more benefits outside the curses themselves. But simply cursing our opponents is only half the battle, since we need to make the most of our commander's card draw as well. In order to accomplish this, we'll be running a good number of ways to blow up our own enchantments for benefits and trigger Lynde, lessening our reliance on our opponent's ability to decurse themselves and giving us the option to change our curse victims while we get card advantage. Ways to double up on our curses will also be used, allowing us to get multiple copies of our most vicious hexes on board and completely cripple their unfortunate recipients. Now, as you may imagine, our opponents aren't going to be enjoying this nearly as much as we will, meaning they'll be turning their forces against us sooner than later in an effort to stop our hexing ways. Unfortunately for them, they may find that their forces are just as hexed as they are, as we'll be running a number of goad effects to ensure attacks meant for us will instead go towards our other opponents, making sure that we're left alone to continue flinging our curses in peace as our opponents continue to fight amongst themselves. Now, let's make sure that Lynde has everything she needs to make her guests comfortable. A lock of hair here, a voodoo doll there, every ritual ingredient in its place so she can happily show them the fruits of her labor, her smiling face being the last thing they see as the final needle falls into place. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Moving straight into the CMC2 slot, we have a trio of curse removal sources with Blood Aspirant, Tavern Scoundrel, and Slaughter Priest of Mogis. Blood Aspirant is a 1/1 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever we sack a permanent, and we can pay 1, a red, tap it and sack a creature or enchantment to have it deal 1 damage to target creature, and prevent it from blocking until end of turn. Serving as the first of many enchantment removal sources to proc our commander, this one growing bigger as it does so and letting us bypass blockers. Tavern Scoundrel is a 1/3 that generates 2 treasures whenever we win a coin flip and lets us pay 1, tap it and sack a permanent to flip a coin, again serving as more curse destruction and occasionally ramping us as a bonus. Slaughter Priest of Mogus is a 2/2 that gains +2/+0 until end of turn whenever we sack a permanent, and that lets us pay 2 and sack a creature or enchantment to give it first strike until end of turn, providing yet more sacking while serving as a decent defensive body when being pumped thanks to its first strike. The CMC 3 slot then brings us its 2 entrants with Grim Guardian and Burnished Heart. Grim Guardian is a 1/4 enchantment creature that has each opponent lose 1 life whenever it or another enchantment ETBs under our control, taking advantage of our large enchantment base by slowly draining our opponent's life as we cast and recur our curses. Burnished Heart is a 2/2 that we can pay 3 and sack to put 2 basic lands from our deck into play tapped, making it a decent land ramp source that helps us sort out our 3-colored mana base. The top half of the CMC 4 slot then brings us some combat control with Vengeful Ancestor, Sly Instigator, and Carter Doomscourge. Vengeful Ancestor is a 3/4 flyer that, when it ETBs or attacks, goads target creature, and whenever a goaded creature attacks, has it deal 1 damage to its controller. Its evasion letting it get through reliably to continue to goad targets, and even throwing in some burn as a bonus that synergizes well with our other goad effects. Sly Instigator is a 2/4 that we can pay a blue and tap to goad an opponent's creature and make it unblockable, ensuring that our opponent's scariest creatures ignore us and get guaranteed damage on our other opponents. Cardor is a 4/3 that, when it ETBs, has all our opponent's creatures attack a player other than us until the end of our next turn, and, whenever an attacking creature dies, has all our opponents lose a life while we gain a life, effectively serving as an AoE goad to shield us from attacks for a turn, while also adding some drain to the mix as our opponent's creatures die from this and other compelled attacks. The latter half of this slot then brings us Forgeborn Oreads, Accursed Witch, and Clever Impersonator. Forgeborn Oreads is a 4/2 enchantment creature that, when it or another enchantment ETBs under our control, deals 1 damage to any target, providing us some extra burn or spot removal that benefits from our enchantment-heavy playstyle. Accursed Witch is a 4/2 that costs 1 less for our opponents to target with spells, and, when it dies, transforms into Infectious Curse, a curse that has the enchanted opponent lose 1 life while we gain 1 life on their upkeep, and has any spells that we cast on them cost 1 less, easily being able to be turned into a curse thanks to our sack effects, providing us with both a drain effect for our opponents and a ramp source for our curses, all while being recurable on its creature side thanks to our commander. Clever Impersonator is a 0/0 that can come into play as any non-land permanent on the battlefield, enabling us to double up on curses in play and, like the previous entry, still being recurable by our commander if it copies a curse. The CMC 5 slot then starts us off with a pair of goad creatures, those being Coveted Peacock and Karazakar the Eye Tyrant. Coveted Peacock is a 3/4 flyer that, when it attacks, goads target creature the defending player controls, giving us another evasive goader that can continually attack safely to keep attacks from coming at us. Karazakar is a 5/5 that, when it attacks, taps down a creature the defending player controls and goads it. Additionally, whenever an opponent attacks someone other than us, it has both them and us draw a card and lose a life, directly redirecting attacks with its first ability while tapping down blockers in the process, and more subtly redirecting attacks elsewhere with its second ability with the promise of card advantage, which we'll benefit off of as well. Then we close out this slot with a pair of black entrants, those being Bitterheart Witch and Doomwake Giant. Bitterheart Witch is a 1/2 who, when it dies, searches our deck for a curse and puts it directly into play attached to target player, making it a potent tutor effect that we can easily proc ourselves thanks to our sack effects to get our most powerful curses directly into play. Doomwake Giant is a 4/6 enchantment creature who, when it or another enchantment we control ETBs, has all our opponent's creatures gain -1/-1 until the end of the turn, helping us keep our opponent's boards clear of smaller creatures while leaving ours untouched. Coming to the CMC 6 slot in our last trio of creatures, we have Dreamshaper Shaman, Geode Rager, and Thoughrender Lamia. Dreamshaper Shaman is a 5/4 enchantment creature who, on our end step, lets us pay 2 a red and sack a permanent to reveal cards from our deck until we hit a non-land permanent, putting that card directly into the battlefield and sending the rest to the bottom of the deck in a random order, making it another curse sack outlet that can immediately bring up another card to replace it in addition to proccing our commander. Geode Rager is a 4/3 with first strike that, when we play a land, has us goad all creatures target player controls, serving as a consistent way to prevent our opponent's entire board from touching us turn after turn so long as we continue making our land drops. Thoughrender Lamia is a 5/3 enchantment creature who, when it or another enchantment ETBs under our control, has each opponent discard a card, causing a massive amount of hand disruption for our opponents as a payoff for our enchantment-heavy build. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we have Read the Runes, an X spell that draws us X cards, then has us discard and or sack permanents equal to that amount, getting us some additional card advantage as we destroy our curses to enable our commander, all at instant speed. The CMC 2 slot then brings us its pair of entries with Terminate and Perilous Research. Terminate destroys target creature and prevents it from regenerating, making it an efficient removal spell with upside in case we run into regenerating targets. Perilous Research has us draw 2 cards, then sacrifice a permanent, providing some card advantage and instant speed sac effect for our curses, minimizing the window of opportunity our opponents will have to take advantage of the curses being on us. Then we reach the CMC 3 slot and a pair of removal spells with Chaos Warp and Bedevil. Chaos Warp shuffles target permanent back into its owner's deck, then has the owner reveal the top card, allowing them to put it into play for free if it's a permanent, making it a very flexible non-destruction removal spell that, while somewhat risky, is still worth running due to its coverage. Bedevil destroys target creature, artifact, or planeswalker, giving us another removal spell that deals with a variety of targets and, unlike the previous entry, has no downside. The CMC 4 slot then brings us some combat control with our last 2 instants, Illusionist's Gambit and Domineering Will. Illusionist's Gambit, which can only be played on the declared blocker step of an opponent's turn, removes and untaps all attacking creatures from that combat and then grants that player another combat phase in which they must use those creatures to attack again but cannot attack us, allowing us to redirect an opponent's entire attack elsewhere and forcing the rest of the table to endure that attack in our place. Domineering Will has target player gain control of up to 3 target non-attacking creatures until the end of the turn, untapping them and forcing them to block if able, pulling double duty as a way to protect our life totals with surprise blockers, as well as being a way to rid ourselves of specific creatures by throwing them in front of incoming attacks. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. The CMC 1 slot brings us Cracked Earth, which has each player sacrifice a permanent, serving as an easy way to send a curse to the grave while also digging our opponent's resources in the process, all for the cost of a single mana. Skipping to the CMC 3 slot, we have Painful Truths and Read the Bones, both of which draw us cards at the cost of life, the former drawing us X and losing us X, which is equal to the number of different colors used to cast it, and the latter scrying 2, drawing 2, and losing us 2 life, both of which provide a good amount of card advantage for the cost. The CMC 4 slot then brings us Disrupt Decorum, which goads all creatures we don't control, fulfilling the same role as Carter to prevent attacks on us for a turn while forcing everyone else to attack each other instead. Reaching the CMC 5 slot, we come to our last sorcery with Replication Technique, which lets us create a token copy of a permanent we control and lets us do it twice at the cost of letting an opponent copy its effect thanks to Demonstrate, usually getting us 2 additional copies of a curse of our choice to hamper our opponents even further. That's it for our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. It's going to be mostly curses all the way down in this category, starting off in the CMC 2 slot with its first 3 entrants being Curse of the Pierced Heart, Curse of Shaken Faith, and Curse of Stalked Prey. Curse of the Pierced Heart has enchanted player take 1 damage on their upkeep, its damage being middling but serving as a low-cost curse that we can sack to enable our commander. Curse of Shaken Faith deals 2 damage to the enchanted player every time they cast a spell after their first or copy a spell, racking us up some decent burn as our opponents play their spells, and being absolutely devastating against spell-slinger decks. Curse of Stalked Prey has any creature who deals combat damage to the enchanted player gain a +1/+1 counter, incentivizing our opponents to attack the curse's recipient to grow their creatures and allowing us to do the same. Then we wrap up this slot with Trespasser's Curse, which has the enchanted player lose a life while we gain a life whenever a creature ETBs under their control, providing us some decent drain and being particularly good against go-wide decks to drain them out quickly while padding out our own life totals. Moving on to the CMC 3 slot, we'll start off with some red curses in the form of Curse of Chaos, Curse of the Nightly Hunt, and Maddening Hex. Curse of Chaos lets anyone who attacks the cursed player discard a card, then draw a card, again tempting attacks away from us by allowing our opponents to rummage, which we can also take advantage of to prune our hands. Curse of the Nightly Hunt forces the enchanted player's creatures to attack every turn if able, severely disrupting our opponent's board states with compelled attacks, and helping us break stalled board states. Maddening Hex deals 1d6 damage to the enchanted player whenever they cast a non-creature spell, then attaches itself to another one of our opponents at random, making it quite a chaotic burn spell that can get a lot of mileage depending on how many instants and flash speed spells our opponents happen to be running. A trio of black curses is up next with Curse of Leeches, Curse of Disturbance, and Curse of Restless Dead. Curse of Leeches has the enchanted player lose a life while we gain a life on their upkeep, and has Daybound, transforming into Leeching Lurker, a 4/4 with lifelink when it becomes night, reverting back to Curse of Leeches and attaching itself to a player when it becomes day again, serving as some decent life gain on both its sides, but not being recurred by our commander if it dies as Leeching Lurker, so do be aware of that. Curse of Disturbance has anyone who attacks the enchanted player create a 2/2 zombie while doing the same for us, helping us grow our board state as our opponents swing into each other, either of their own volition or when we force them to do so. Curse of Restless Dead creates a 2/2 zombie with Decayed for us whenever the enchanted player has a land ETB under their control, giving us some disposable bodies as our opponents make their land drops, while being very good to deal with Lands Matters decks by getting us huge board states quickly unless the enchanted player pumps the brakes. Then we get to our blue curses with Curse of Inertia and Curse of Verbosity. Curse of Inertia has any player attacking the enchanted player tap or untap a permanent of their choice. providing a surprising amount of flexibility by tapping down and untapping creatures, lands, or anything else to benefit ourselves or hamper our opponents. Curse of Verbosity has any player who attacks the enchanted player draw a card, while we draw a card as well, being a very tempting offer in the form of card advantage to swing into the cursee, all while gaining us card advantage in the process. Then we close out this slot with our only non-curse enchantment, Mirror Maid, which ETBs as a copy of any artifact or enchantment, allowing us to get an additional copy of a curse of our choice for more hexing goodness, while also being recurable by our commander so long as it copies a curse. Moving on to the CMC4 slot, we have its single entrant with Torment of Scarabs, which has the enchanted player, on their upkeep, either lose 3 life, sack a permanent, or discard a card, all 3 effects being pretty good at hampering our opponents in some way, while actually being a pretty good curse to keep on ourselves as a way to sack another curse on each of our upkeeps to enable our commander even further. The CMC5 slot then starts us off with a trio of very detrimental curses with Curse of Misfortunes, Curse of Thirst, and Curse of Bloodletting. Curse of Misfortunes has us, on our upkeep, search our deck for a curse and attach it to the enchanted player, making it one of, if not the most powerful curse in our arsenal by allowing us to tutor up and play our most powerful curses in our deck turn after turn for free on the unfortunate victim. Curses like Curse of Thirst, which on the enchanted player's upkeep deals damage to them equal to the amount of curses they have, serving as a potent curse payoff to take advantage of our curse-laden opponents and quickly put them out of their misery after only a few turns. Curse of Bloodletting simply doubles the amount of damage the enchanted player would take from any source, putting the unlucky victim of this curse in a very precarious spot as our curses, our creatures, and our opponent's goaded creatures will make quick work of their life totals thanks to their newly acquired fragile state unless they're able to deal with it. This slot then closes out with Curse of Obsession and Curse of Surveillance. Curse of Obsession has the enchanted player draw 2 additional cards on their draw step and discard their entire hand on their end step, forcing the affected player to use or lose their resources for a massive amount of disruption, while being a spectacular curse to recur with our commander, letting us draw 3, then 2 more when we pawn it to someone else, effectively drawing us 5 with no downside. Curse of Surveillance has any number of players, other than the enchanted player, draw cards equal to the amount of curses attached to that player, giving us another curse payoff in the form of card advantage that we can use as leverage when negotiating. The CMC6 slot ends up being another single entry one with Curse of Fool's Wisdom, which has the enchanted player lose 2 life while we gain 2 life every time they draw a card, draining for at least 2 every turn and possibly more if our opponents choose to draw more or we force them to. Finally, reaching the CMC7 slot, we come to our last and largest curses with Curse of Unbinding and Cruel Reality. Curse of Unbinding, on the enchanted player's upkeep, has that player reveal cards from the top of their deck until they reveal a creature, putting that creature into play under our control and sending all the other cards revealed this way to the grave, getting us a free creature into play at no cost every turn while slowly milling our opponents in the process. Cruel Reality, on the enchanted player's upkeep, has that player sack a creature or planeswalker, having them lose 5 life instead if they can't, slowly grinding out our opponent's resources and eventually their life totals, while being particularly nasty if we can get multiple copies stacked onto one person through our various clone effects. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Starting off in the CMC0 slot, we have Claws of Gix, which lets us pay 1 and sack a permanent to gain 1 life, making it a cheap way to get our curses in the grave to enable our commander while gaining us a bit of life in the process. The CMC1 slot then brings us some ramp options with Soul Ring and Wayfarer's Bauble. Soul Ring taps for 2 colorless, and we're running it because it's the best ramp in our format, letting us hit our bigger curses way ahead of curve if we're able to open with it. Second up is Wayfarer's Bauble, which lets us pay 2, tap it and sack it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, making it a very good source of land ramp that hits the board early and helps us fix our 3-color mana base. The CMC2 slot then starts us off with some mana rocks, starting with Arcane Signet, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Izzet Signet and Rakdos Signet, both of which we can pay 1 and tap to generate 2 out of our 3 colors, and Charcoal Diamond, Fire Diamond, and Sky Diamond, all 3 of which come into play tapped and tap for 1 of our respective colors. Then we close out this slot and our artifacts with 2 non-rocks in the form of Bloodthirsty Blade and Strionic Resonator. Bloodthirsty Blade is an equipment that gives the equipped creature +2/+0, goads it, and costs 1 to attach it to a creature an opponent controls, serving as a cheap source of goad that we can redeploy if a bigger threat arises or when its wielder gets itself killed. Strionic Resonator lets us pay 2 and tap it to copy triggered ability we control and choose new targets for the copy if applicable, giving us an easy way to double up on curse triggers and our commander's second ability to redistribute curses, which ends up helping the deck's pace immensely. That covers all our artifacts, and since we have no planeswalkers in this build, let's skip straight to the land base. Starting off with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity, Exotic Orchard, which taps for any color an opponent's land would be able to produce, Smoldering Marsh and Sunken Hollow, both of which come into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands and tap for a red or blue and black respectively, Crumbling Necropolis, which comes into play tapped and taps for 1 mana of any of our colors, Temple of Deceit, Temple of Epiphany, and Temple of Malice, all 3 of which come into play tapped, tap for 1 of 2 of our colors, and scry 1 when they ETB, Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless, and we can tap it and sack it to put 2 basic lands of the same type from our deck into play tapped, and finally Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. Then for our utility lands, we'll be running Bojuga Bog and Ghost Quarter. Bojuga Bog comes into play tapped, taps for a black, and exiles target opponent's graveyard when it ETBs, making it a good source of player-specific graveyard hate from our land slot. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless, and we can tap it and sack it to destroy target land, letting its owner replace it with a basic from their deck, giving us some good spot removal that deals with our opponent's utility lands and can be used to fix our colors if we're really desperate. Lastly, we're running 6 islands, 8 swamps, and 9 mountains as our basics to fill out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 19 creatures including the commander, 7 instants, 5 sorceries, 22 enchantments, 11 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 22 curses, 6 cards that care about curses, 4 cards that care about enchantments, 8 cards that can get rid of our curses, 4 cards that can copy curses or their triggers, and 10 cards that can manipulate combat, giving us a good selection of curses alongside a number of payoffs that benefit us further as we play them, a handful of ways to duplicate our curses, and a decent number of ways to destroy our own curses to enable our commander, and finally multiple ways to redirect our opponent's creatures to prevent them from swinging into us and instead into our other opponents. For general deck stats, we have 12 ramp sources, 8 card draw sources, 9 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe. Our draw being a bit lower than usual thanks to our commander effectively turning our curses into card advantage, while our wipes are low since we're more concerned about turning our opponent's creatures against each other instead of destroying them, with our ramp and removal remaining at an acceptable rate. Looking at our mana curve, we have 1 0-drop, 4 1-drops, 17 2-drops, 15 3-drops, 11 4-drops, 10 5-drops, 4 6-drops, and 2 7-drops, giving us roughly a mid-game curve that allows us to get our ramp and smaller curses out early, enabling our commander in the mid to late game, letting us get to our bigger curses faster, as well as letting us set up more expensive sources of goad to start redirecting our opponent's attacks after we've cursed them. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.87, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For some side grades, there's a few other curses that could warrant consideration. Curse of Echoes, Curse of Death's Hold, and Curse of Oblivion are all good cheaper options, providing extra spells, smaller creatures, and graveyard hate respectively, while Curse of Shallow Graves is a pricier option that gets anyone attacking the cursed player extra board state whenever they do so to incentivize extra attacking. More creatures that care about enchantments and by extension curses can also find a home here. Protean Thaumaturge, Agent of Erebos, and Caliphate Beloved of the Sea can all take further advantage of our enchantments by giving us clone effects, graveyard hate, and protection from targeted removal respectively. For upgrades, Fraying Sanity, Curse of Opulence, and Curse of Vengeance are all good curses that help disrupt our opponents or help us generate value even further. Infernal Tribute gives us a continual way to sack our curses for even more card advantage, while Paradox Haze helps our curses trigger more frequently. Estrid's Evocation and Copy Enchantment both give us additional curse clone effects to further double up on them, while Lithiform Engine can double up our curse triggers in addition to its other great copying effects. Grenzo Havoc Razor could also be a good include to get extra goad effects as our creatures swing in for damage. Finally, tutor effects such as Demonic Tutor and Vampiric Tutor would be great additions to search up any of our curses or any other card we may need whenever we may need it. We just need to make sure we're willing to pay the tuition cost because these tutors sure don't come cheap. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, another thanks is in order since this channel just cracked its 1600 sub milestone. Thank you all for the continued support in helping the channel grow, and I hope you continue to support the channel in the future. Looking at the results of last week's poll, it looks like Graham Carolus' Stalwart Slayer has been able to take the top spot for the Inquisition, something I'm sure no one expected, so expect to see a high damage burn build featuring him next week. Moving on to this week's poll, we'll be giving some of our silver medal winners a shot at gold by bringing back some of our second place entrants from previous polls, those being Ludwig Necrogenius, Eloise Nefalius Luth, and Vadric Astral Archmage. Please cast your vote in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders from Midnight Hunt you'd like to see on a future poll. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as the channel can't grow without your support. And if you'd like to show your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, feel free to buy me a coffee at the link in the description. Also feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you want to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.